Welcome back, everyone. This is Unit 5, Part 2, where we are thinking about how do we know that our communication strategies are actually effective in achieving the goals that we had in mind. You've just spent a little bit of time developing a first theory of change and depicting that as an action logic model. And in this part here, we're now moving toward developing indicators. Something that tells you you are having an impact. How would you know? Well, in order to get there, I want us to think a little bit more about those theories of change, and you will see why I keep harking on it. Basically, the better our theories of change, the more opportunities you have to actually trace your work all the way to something that happens in the world. So let's do that. And I guess I want to do that by first starting to put the communication into its larger context. Very often you are not hired to just be the communication officer. And even if you are, your job is to do that in concert with all the rest that your organization, your agency, your entity does. Even if you're trying to change your friends, if you're trying to affect their behavior, it is part of the larger effort of you being connected to your friends, right? So you have to see the specific thing that you're doing in that larger context. And you can think of that as something that isn't done just one time, but is carried out in stages. It's very important for us to break it down as much as we can into reasonable chunks of time. And in fact, you have done this already quite intuitively in your strategies, laying out, what you would do first, reaching out to maybe a champion or getting to know your audience. And then based on that, designing the next step. And the next step might be just to raise awareness. And once you have people aware, then to take them to the next thing, right? So I want you to think of what you are trying to achieve and break that down into coherent objectives, something that you can achieve maybe in the first month or in the first phase of something, and then what comes after that and what comes after that. So this is really breaking down your entire strategy into smaller pieces, temporally aligned. One needs to precede the other in order for you to achieve your goal. And then even finer, you might say, well, in order to get to that first objective, there are a couple of things, a couple of milestones that we need to achieve, or clear ways in which we can, know we're on our path. Because, how often is it, right? We're doing 1,000 things and we sort of forget what we're actually working toward. We get so busy thinking of those small things. Here, I want you to sort of break it down from that big goal all the way down to the daily, the weekly, the monthly, to kind of see, how could we know we're making progress and that we're actually achieving the preconditions for the next step and the next step and the next step. And each one of those, the milestones, achieving those first and then the second and the third objective on the way to that ultimate goal, are all places where you might possibly find signs, right? Indicators that you are achieving what you're trying to achieve. So when I'm going to ask you in a little while to go back to your first draft theory of change and how you depicted that in an action logic model, I want you to see, are there places we can break it down a little bit more, just so we can more clearly see our steps from one to the other. I'll give you a couple of examples. These are not, necessarily out of the climate change context, but a couple that I found in a good guide that I recommend to you. It's in the supplementary materials. It's called Are We There Yet? Guide. And it is specifically about evaluating communication. So let's just say your objective might be to secure the support of a senior member of a particular government committee to increase funding for combating malaria by the end of year 1, whatever that year is. A milestone on the way to that might be that by the end of 6 months, you have received an invitation to meet with a senior member of that committee. And you have, in order to secure that invitation, you have actually prior to that sent them policy briefings on combating malaria, and maybe some additional information that you might have found important to send to whet their appetite for meeting with you, right? Some qualitative measures you might associate with that is not only that you have that invitation, that's one indicator, but also that you have made contacts in that office, that you have obtained sample briefs from the member's office to know more about your audience, right? And you might think of other things. Maybe you required that somebody made an introduction, or you went to several hearings with that committee, so you better understood how they're working and what they're thinking like, or whatever. So these are all ways in which you might break down getting ultimately to your objective. Another example is that you might want to position your organization as a credible source of information on childhood obesity with key media outlets by the end of year 2. So this might all be, part of the same project here. I don't know. This is just a couple of examples to give you how to break it down. One milestone toward that your organization perceived as that credible source of information is to establish a relationship with a journalist from key media outlets by the end of year 1, because you need that journalist to write stories that essentially portray you as that credible source of information. And again, in order to get there, you might think of communication exchanges indicate increased interest by this journalist. Your organization's spokesperson is quoted at least twice in that particular media outlet or somewhere else. Organization's blog is referenced in at least one key media outlet. In other words, people are beginning to find that you are, that credible organization. So you can see how, in these measures, what they call measures, these indicators, you're beginning to become that they're suggestive that you must be the place they now go to for information, right? So think about in your own strategy, is there a way in which you would be able to tell, or someone sitting outside, that you have achieved a certain milestone, a certain objective? What would be a meaningful way to tell that? It doesn't have to be, as you can see here, it doesn't have to be quantitative. Sometimes that's what people ask for, and we can come back to that question in the conversation in our last Zoom meeting as well. But oftentimes, these are the things that really tell you whether or not you're getting anywhere. I want to give you another example, just to kind of make that real for you and what I'm looking for. So this is an example where a scientist tried to look at that science, that research that he's doing, actually having an impact on the conditions in the environment. So that, whatever the research project was, you name that at the outset. That's your focus, that's your priority. And ultimately what you might be aiming for is something in, actual seeing changes in governance and policies and decisions, or if you're really impactful, improved environmental conditions, economic well-being, social equity, public health outcomes are improved, whatever. Depends obviously on what the research problem is. But think about that. That's what you ultimately want, right? And with your communication strategy, it's just like that. You want ultimately to be safe and have, a vibrant economy and sustainable living conditions and all the rest of it. Oftentimes, it's really, really difficult to wait that long and to trace what you did in your communication all the way there. So you might decide instead to look at something that's sort of a precursor to that ultimate impact that you want to have. And so here you see again elements of an action logic model with inputs and context, actions, activities, outputs that a researcher might be involved in. And their focus of the evaluation is actually on this piece here. 4 different types of impacts. Conceptual impacts, meaning people target audiences have gained new knowledge or awareness. You often mention that. Um, Instrumental impacts, that the results of that research have actually been directly applied to some decision. There might be what they call connectivity impacts, that you have created the opportunity for new partnerships to be established or to be strengthened, or you have helped build capacity in some ways. And you can see, think about this, that you need all of these four preconditions in order to get to changes in governance, changes in policies or in decisions, and which of course ultimately lead to those longer term outcomes. You might very well be able in the next, half a year, in the next year, be able to measure these precursors. And based on what we know from social science, based on what we observe about how policy change happens, how decisions get made, these are pretty reasonable precursors that are important to put in place if you want to achieve any of the other types of long-term outcomes. So this is just an example of where you break it down and don't go directly from an output, if you will, to an outcome, but you put something there that you actually think you might be able to measure and see. So again, when you go back to your theory of change, can you think of weaving between these boxes, particularly between outputs and outcomes? Can you put in there some things that you believe are the precursors in order to get to that change that you ultimately want to see? And that's where your theory of change comes in. That's where talking to your training partner and sort of really, how does this work? What do we think is necessary in order for policy change to happen? That might very well, that careful thinking might very well affect how you think about your strategy, your communication strategy in the first place. You might say, well, if we need to achieve coalition building because that is ultimately what we think will make the difference on policy, well, why aren't we focusing on that in the first place and try to, rethink our strategy? This is the kind of stuff where, I think your communication strategy can get incredibly compelling because it gets linked to an action-oriented strategy to get to action. But you need to uncover, what do you think are those conditions, and can we work toward them? Here's another one. This is from the World Resources Institute that did a review of the literature, which I'm citing here, and I strongly recommend it to you because it's a really good piece of work, where they looked at every single case that they could find where someone said, we mainstreamed adaptation into development. And they basically said, well, it happens to seem to require 5 things. There needs to be leadership, there need to be policy frameworks, there need to be coordination mechanisms, information tools, and financial processes. And that's how you ever get from having just a plan to actually getting something done on the ground. Okay, so that's the framework. That's, if you will, their theory of change, right? Of how you get from just a planning document to something happening on the ground. And now you might ask, well, how does communication feature into this? Because who do you need to communicate to make someone a leader? How can you help bring the policy frameworks in place? How can you help with the distribution of information and tools, and even to know what information to put in there and what tools people need? Communication is so essential in coordination mechanisms, right? It's the software, it's the it's the glue that holds coordination together. And the same as what can communication help with in terms of financial processes. We talked about that in one of the examples you guys brought up of, there being loans available, but nobody's using that, right? So you might be playing that one arrow, that one role in this larger picture of change. So again, I want you to think about in each of these theories that you have come up with, how your communication features into these larger processes of social change, and how you might then be able to tell, where are some of the possibilities where you can see change that you're affecting. And here's another example, and that's one of my own. I've been studying the question of how to evaluate success of adaptation in 4 projects over the course of 10 years. And it has started with basically engaging stakeholders on the ground in coastal areas on the west coast of the United States. And it has, almost at the same time, I was involved in co-editing a book on successful adaptation. And then I wanted to basically use what we've learned so far in these 2 projects and test it on the ground to develop indicators and metrics of change. And so I worked with a number of national estuarine research reserves here in the country, and 5 different ones. And then we developed together a toolkit which you can explore on your own time. If you're involved in adaptation measures, you might find it quite interesting. But basically, based on this particular set of projects, I've learned a lot about evaluation and about indicators and metrics, and I want to share with you a couple of examples. In this instance here, what we came up with in the first instance was a framework of, if you wanted to tell the story as to whether or not adaptation to climate change was successful, it's basically needed 6 dimensions that you needed to tell in that story. You needed to look at the process that people had put in place. You needed to look at what kind of and how good the decisions were that they were making. You needed to see whether or not they're actually taking some action, like, taking that next step. And then you needed to look at whether or not they actually achieved the outcomes that they wanted to achieve, and whether or not those outcomes were good or maladaptive or whatever. And for each one of these steps, what was necessary is to make sure that whoever was adapting had the capacity to do it and was able to overcome whatever barriers they faced, sometimes financial ones, sometimes political ones, scientific ones, you name it. So that was our framework that we worked with. And then you might want to say, well, so that's not about communication, but in each one of these steps, you needed communication to play into it. Again, for me, communication is the glue that holds this whole together. It's the fuel that makes it work. Try to do adaptation without communicating, and you know what I mean. So what exactly is then the role in each one of these steps? Again, it gives you an opportunity to look at, where might I find indicators of impact? What if I completely fail in my communication of and in the process for adaptation? What if that is simply, not working? I'm not sure I'm going to find a heck of a lot of good stuff in all the rest of it, because there is sort of a logic and a sequence to it. It's the process is foundational. It's not all linear in terms of timing, but it is certainly one of the essential components of success. So when you can attach your places of word to look for indicators of change and impact, when you can attach it to a framework like this one or the one earlier from the World Resources Institute, then it's a lot easier to detect the change. You basically train your lens on where to look for the indicators. And that's why this is a theory of change right here, right? In some ways. And it helps me to then identify where to look for indicators and metrics. So what I want you to do now is to go back to whatever you had developed in your draft in round 1 of exercise 2 and refine that. And you might find, once you do that, you have to redraw it quite substantially, or maybe just tweak it. I'm not, pushing you one way or the other, but I want you to become as specific and fine-tuned as possible so that you have opportunities to detect change. If you make big boxes and they just say change in behavior, then you might simply not have a clear enough lens or a fine scaled enough lens to see what has happened. If you put the milestones on the way to that behavior change, if you can put the milestones on the way to policy change or whatever it is, then you can actually identify where your communication has to focus, but you can also identify where you might see change in the world. So there's guidance on how to do that in the folder, in the Google folder. I want you to go do that. And when you're done, then come back here. I'll just ask you to pause the pause here and then come back when you're ready. So now what you have done is in the exercises up until exercise 15, you developed a communication strategy. And right now I'm asking you to really look at your underlying assumptions of how this change happened and depict that in an action logic model. Of course, there's a clear relationship, right? Ideally, you actually begin your communication strategy by thinking about that theory of change very carefully with your partners, with your internal staff, whatever it is. Both can influence each other. We are doing it now. This is often when it happens, and it's a learning experience right there that we do evaluation at the end when really we should start with thinking evaluatively from the beginning. Be that as it may, but there is a clear relationship between the two, which I'm sure you've discovered, and you might iterate and refine one or the other because of what you have written down in either one. Now, based on this refined theory of change that you have, now we're ready to actually think about where are the indicators and appropriate metrics to track them. And that's where your communication strategy, your underlying bigger theory of change, your bigger theory and strategy relates to your, if you will, M&E strategy. Now, you might have heard M&E, monitoring and evaluation, 1,000 times, and you might be really sick of it. And I completely agree with you that many, many times they are perfunctory exercises. They're not very meaningful, but they can be, again, in the spirit of learning from what you're tracking to help you refine how you approach something, get better at it, and simply have a bigger impact, which is ultimately what you want. So they're closely related. And I really encourage you to see them as a trifecta, as something that should always be in your back pocket, those three things, thinking about them at the same time. A couple of words to lay the groundwork. What do I mean by an indicator and what do I mean by a metric? And again, I say this, what my definition is, because everyone and their uncle uses these terms differently. Measures, you saw that already. There are many other ways and oftentimes just the opposite way of defining. So I just want to be clear. I'm not wedded to you using it like this from here on. I just want you to know what I'm using in this particular unit. So an indicator for me is a quality or a trait that suggests, or as may be the case, as indicates the effectiveness or progress or success or impact that you're seeking. So it's a quality, it's a trait that indicates this progress that you're looking for. The metric is a variable that represents this indicator. It can be measured sometimes when it's quantifiable, and sometimes it just simply can be tracked, through qualitative information. That could be a yes and no answer. It could be, naming certain things that happen or occur, or it could be a story that you tell that links one thing to the other, or shows you what is changing. So the indicator is, if you will, hierarchically higher. It is the more abstract thing, whereas the metric is trying to get as close as possible to it. Sometimes there isn't a perfect match. If you're looking for, if the indicator is health and well-being, your metric might very well be, the number of people who die in a disaster, or the number of people who remain healthy in COVID, or whatever, something of that nature. So one is more specific, but it may or may not capture the entirety of that indicator. Here's a couple of other examples. So what if your goal was that you want to help people make a good decision, and you define what good means? Or you and your stakeholders define what a good decision is. But let's just say it was, they would declare a decision as good if it was made transparently. Now, transparent is the indicator. How would you measure that? Well, it's not an easy one to measure, but you might use a metric like the availability of relevant documents or information at free accessible websites? And the answer here is yes, no, or some, right? Or it could be quantifiable by asking people in a survey how many people perceive the effort as having been transparent. So you can see that how you measure transparency can be very different, right? Quantitative or qualitative, and using very different instruments. Here's another example. Let's say you want to evaluate whether or not your engagement process was good. Well, someone, you and maybe the participants in that engagement process, might find one valuable indicator of a good process, that it was broad and sustained. Okay, how would you measure that? Maybe by the number of community groups that participated in the meeting per year or per effort, whatever. Or that in terms of broad engagement, the representation of different sectors, different community groups. So it could be the number of people per sector, or maybe you're interested in different age groups or different classes, or whatever the case may be, right? So you can always see that there is not just one metric per indicator, and they can be quantitative and qualitative, and you might choose both. They might be very valuable to get there. How do you get those indicators? Well, that's the tricky part about all evaluation. That's where it gets creative. For me, I often work with the people that I'm doing an evaluation for to tell me what they think a good whatever the thing would be, that they get to define those indicators, and then I go and develop my survey instrument or my interview protocol accordingly to see if I can get answers to the things that they're most interested in. There's also a number of different ways to get there, and just the examples that I just gave you give you a range of options. So one of them was you develop this action logic model, and you put basically an indicator and for around each one of these elements, one or more, and then you identify metrics. Once you have the indicators, then you see, well, how would we measure it? How would we track it? And you define those. And then you set up maybe some internal tracking sheets, or manual or digitally, or you have it tracked externally, whatever the case may be. But essentially, you begin from this action logic model and then attach indicators and metrics to it. It's different ways to get to it. A second one might be that you have this theory of change already. You have this conceptual framework, say, of success, whatever the success of your strategy might be, and you apply this particular theory, this conception of how to get to success in a real-world setting, and then you look for indicators of that success in the core dimensions of your framework. So if you think back to the one that I showed you about successful adaptation, I would look for indicators that are attached to the process, the decision making, the implementation, the outcomes, the capacity, the barriers. So that basically that theory would give me a framework, in the same way that for the World Resources Institute's framework of how to get from a plan to action with those 5 dimensions or 5 conditions, they would look for indicators of leadership, for coordination mechanisms, for finance processes, and so on and so forth. So it's essentially, there is some underlying understanding that you have that you then attach indicators and metrics to. Here's another one that I've worked through, which was actually really fascinating. I worked with a community, and we developed a vision of success together without any underlying conception or framework, theoretical framework of how they thought that would happen. But just what do they love? What do they want to see preserved in their community? We then did some strategic planning, where basically they said, well, if we wanted to get toward that vision of success, how would we do that? And the indicators and or targets that we came up with were basically those milestones that would help us to see we're actually making progress toward it. And then our indicators were all attached to those strategies. They were totally linked, so that they could trace from the vision to the strategy to the indicator. They could exactly see a line of sight of how to get to that. And then once we had the indicators, then the work of the metrics had to still occur. and setting that up. So you can start from theory, from a concept, or from a vision that your community creates, and then attach your indicators and metrics along the way to it, and then have to set up a way to track them and measure them. You've probably seen this many, many times, that good indicators are smart. Well, it turns out the SMART acronym stands for many things, and you see them here. Often they stand for they should be specific, they should be measurable, assignable, attainable, accessible, whatever, realistic, time-related, which in the context of climate change is important because the baseline is constantly changing. So there are many different ways to translate this, but I want you to keep this in mind when you start to develop your own, that you first think freely about your indicators and metrics, and then go back and actually check, are they specific enough? Could someone else do this? Are they measurable? Can someone actually do it? Is someone in charge of tracking this, or is it assigned to them, in other words? Are they realistic? Are they just too wildly ambitious and nobody can really ever achieve those kinds of things? So those are the kinds of things that I want you to later check as well, just to make sure that you get a good set. And so I want to actually apply what I just said to you in theoretical terms, again, to this particular example here, where we already talked about the framework of components or dimensions of adaptation success and the role that communication played in it. So recall that, number one. And number two, remember what we talked about earlier in the first session on why you would want to bother with evaluating effectiveness in the first place. Some had to do with communication and engagement, some with deliberate planning, fundraising, accountability, and supporting your own learning. So those are really the uses or the purpose, why you would bother, right? So if you take those two things, you can turn that into a matrix. You have at the top these core dimensions, and on the left-hand side here in the column, the reason why you would want to bother. If you think about why would you want to know about the process? Why would you want to know about the decision? Why would you want to know about the next step taken, and so on and so forth? You can come up with very different kinds of indicators. Let me give you this as an example. So, for example, if you're really interested in the process and you want to communicate how good that process was to your stakeholders, you might be looking for, was it inclusive? Did people really have meaningful opportunities of influence? Right? Let's say I'll come back to the other examples in a moment. Let's say your interest in doing an evaluation of these different core dimensions of success is that you can help with deliberate planning and decisions. Your indicator there might be, did this process follow the well-known standards of good planning? Timely, transparent, whatever, all those good things. If you're interested in, say, justifying a funding request and you are interested in saying something about the process, well, it might be really important that you considered not just monetary impacts, but that you looked at other things that your stakeholders care about. And it's really important for you to communicate that in your funding requests, right? In the same line, let's just go across here and see. If you wanted to look at the, say, capacity, whether or not capacity is being built through this process that you're looking at and you're trying to get funding for, well, you would be very, very interested in highlighting and looking at how much did we actually invest in capacity building, right? Or how much do we want to build? If you develop a project proposal that is supposedly, for adaptation, and you do not invest in capacity, a funder might say, well, I don't believe this project is going to be successful, right? So you can see how for different audiences, for different purposes, looking at each of these different dimensions, you might actually look at different aspects of the very same thing. Again, go up the lines here in the first line, communication engagement, and you wanted to highlight something about how you have built capacity. Well, one thing that you might be really interested in is to highlight to your stakeholders that you have enabled community members to facilitate these dialogues themselves. They have built skills to do that. And they will feel proud that you pointed that out. They will feel proud that they have owned this process themselves. So again, for each one of these different purposes along different dimensions of your own framework, whatever your framework is, you might have different ideas of why it's important, or what indicators might be meaningful and to whom. I'll just, don't go through this in all detail, but you kind of begin to see the pattern here of or the major argument that I'm trying to make, that your indicators are very much dependent on not only what you're looking at, but why you're looking at them. Why is it meaningful? To whom? And does that sound familiar? Does that sound like a communication strategy? That you think about your audience and your goals from the start? Same is true with evaluation. Your indicators will reflect that. They should reflect that. You don't want to tell everybody everything about your process. You will be very specific depending on why you're doing it, why your audience would care about that, and that's what you highlight. So that's a lot of indicators right here. And you may or may not be able to catch all of them. So in the exercise I'm going to ask you to do is to actually prioritize this too. Again, here, just another example to make this a little bit clearer. Again, when we focus on these elements, not so much on the stuff on the left-hand side, which is much easier to count, and that's where we spend most of our time. I'm not going to do that because you know that. I'm trying to get you to think a little bit more about these aspects that are maybe less familiar to track. So possible indicators for having made a conceptual impact. Well, awareness raised. Sure, you said that. Many of you had that in your communication strategies as an outcome, as a goal. You have to then still think about, well, how would I measure that? Would I use a survey? Would it be qualitative? How do I know that this actually happened? But that's obviously something you would want to know. Have people gained a new understanding based on maybe integrating scientific and indigenous knowledge? It's just an example, right? Or instrumental. Has the information you provided been used in decisions? A database you put together, is that now in expanded use? Or in terms of capacity that you might have built, have people gained skills or build skills? Is there more staff capacity? You might think of financial capacity, all kinds of things. Or in terms of connectivity, many of you talked about partnership, the strength of partnerships. Maybe there was a conflict and that's now resolved. How would you know? But these are the kinds of indicators that would tell you you're making progress, right? The measurement issue comes next after that. Just want you to think about or get ideas for the kinds of things you might be looking for. So, as I said, evaluation is as purpose-driven and as audience-specific as the communication itself. That's what I want you to think through. Why, for what, when, what, for whom are you doing this? And then you can think about, do we have a baseline? Can we really clearly articulate the goals? Can we think through both process and output and outcome measures? And can we actually make, and this is the holy grail of all evaluation, can we make a reasonable case that these things are causally linked? Because you can claim all kinds of things, right? You'd communicated a policy change happened over on the far side, on the right-hand side, and what happened in between? Typically, there's a lot of magic between those two things. And what I want to urge you to think about is, how could you get at a reasonable story that is convincing and persuasive that you actually helped make this happen? Okay. How do we get to it? How do we find those data to tell us? Interviews, focus groups, surveys, observation, quantitative data collection and analysis, content analysis of things on websites, on policy documents, whatever. Those are your typical social science research tools, and they can be as formal or informal as you can muster. Of course, you know, the more formal you do that, the more convincing it is, but sometimes that's not what we have the resources for. We're not necessarily trained, but it's important to consider those things, and I strongly urge you to, you know, draw in partners and work with other people to help you do that if you can't do it yourself. So go play with that. I want you actually to try it out, identify meaningful indicators of impact. You could come up with lists that are 2 miles long of indicators for everything and everything and everything. So think about which ones of these, after you have, you know, brainstormed many, many, many indicators, which ones of those would actually be most telling, most convincing to your boss, most convincing to you, most convincing to your funders, whatever the case may be. So first you know, look at your categories and you identify indicators for each one, and then metrics to measure that, to track them. And then I want you to prioritize, because you just can't do everything. So which are the 10 most influential? I'm not saying it's got to be 10, but you know, what if out of maybe possibly 25 that you came up with, which ones are you really going to track in your case for your strategy that you're working on? I put a template there in the folder for you. It may very well be that those categories don't fit. That's fine. I also put it there in Word format, so you can just replace the categories with whichever ones that you have come up with in drawing your action logic model. Okay, so go do that and come back. We'll pause here, and when you get back, we'll go on. All right, welcome back. So you have now had a chance to think about attaching specific indicators and metrics to your theory of change, your framework, your way of thinking about how your communication will lead to societal impact in one way or another. I don't know if you had a chance to look at this, but here is Raspiek in the interview we've gotten for this particular session for Unit 5. It is a beautiful, beautiful interview with him. If you, I assume you all know him. So it was news for me, and it was wonderful to get to know this poet. And I don't know if you noticed, but about halfway through, he actually speaks a little bit about evaluation. He said, you know, when I ask about poetry and the impact it can have on people, he said, it doesn't mean that poetry will transform you 100%, but it will touch you. It will touch your heart, a milestone, and when it does, there will be change in your behavior. So touching the heart with poetry is, if you will, one of those milestones, one of those preconditions that you would look for. And I guess I want to close this session, this segment, and in many ways this course, with asking you where you have been touched in your heart, in your mind, in your own deepest convictions, and in what ways that may have changed you. So encourage you strongly to listen to this and to come back here and to think of yourself and what we have done here together as you becoming influential, more influential than you have been. If your communication becomes more impactful, you will become more impactful. People will begin to see you as a leader. Anytime you empower people, you inspire people, you help them, you know, go through difficult change, you help them create or share a vision of what could be, you will be seen as a leader. In this class, you have gained more knowledge about how to do that. At least I tried to impart that on you, and I will see how impactful I've been. And that could have been through improving your understanding of change processes, the social change processes, not the climate change processes, the improved understanding of how and what becomes influential in a decision, whether that's at the personal level, at the policy level, in management, practice, anything in a household. And I guess it's given you some ideas about how to prepare for more successful interactions and partnerships in getting to those goals. So in many ways, that is, one way in which I have hoped to help you become that kind of a leader. In my mind, the communication is absolutely essential to you becoming a visible leader in your communities. But you've also, in the course of doing that, actually already practiced some leadership skills. I've asked you multiple times to reflect on your own practice, to uncover your own thinking and assumptions about things, essentially to hone your people skills, to think about the entire social system that you're trying to change and to influence, to be more strategic. And in that process, I probably ask you a number of times to challenge your own thinking and your own behavior of how to communicate and transform that. That whole list here, those are leadership skills. So we've worked on communication, but really we've worked on leadership. And so I guess I want to ask you in closing, how do you see yourself in this change picture? Do you see yourself as informing change? Do you see yourself as initiating or advocating for change? Do you see yourself as a facilitator of change? You can begin to see this is quite different what would be asked of you, but it's putting you in the change picture. You're part of it. Or are you really actively participating? Do you have to enact the same changes as everybody else? Or are you going to be changed through it? So in closing, I'm going to ask you to just write to yourself in your journals, in your notebooks, about how this course has been changing you. Think about these questions. What were some of the big aha moments, the insights that you gained? Maybe something that surprised you. Maybe there are things that this course confirmed for you. Maybe you found yourself really challenged. Something that you just didn't believe or you just don't agree with. Or you want to do, but you just don't know how yet. Where are some of the places that you most want to improve and challenge yourself to learn more and get better at? Is it, working with skeptics or the people who make it really hard? Do you want to be more courageous in expressing your own emotion or putting that emotion into your communication strategy? If you were to set yourself a 5-year goal of becoming that influential leader in your in your communities, in your agency, in your organization, being a really, really powerful communicator, what would that be? What's the aspirational goal for you? What could you commit yourself to do? Now, you don't have to tell anyone. You could, if you want to, share with your training partner after you've done it. But this is for you. This is really for you to think about these questions for yourself. So do that. Let me just quickly give you an outlook to where we're going in the closing session in our Zoom meeting, and then we'll close from here. Well, the next Zoom meeting is the last one, and it is, I guess you can call it job evaluation day for me. We will not only reflect on this particular unit about evaluation and about indicators and metrics, but I will also ask you to evaluate this course. And we will do that in an anonymous fashion, so that, basically you're free to speak, but it's really important for GCCA and for myself to get that feedback, what's working, what's not working for you, and how, where to take that in the future. If there's any questions about the material in this unit, as you know, you can contact myself or Michelle. And If you haven't already sent us in your strategy, please do immediately so I can get back to you with comments by the end of the class. And so with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank all our interviewees for the input they have given. It's been wonderful to get to know you all in this course and to get to know them through those interviews a little bit. I hope you will continue to stay safe and stay well through this not quite post-COVID pandemic at all. I hope that you all can join us for the last meeting, and thank you so much for all the work that you have done, and I hope it's been a fruitful experience for you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.